here with Akio Suzuki, and after he's just performed at Cafe Oto. And first of all, if you'd like to introduce the sound art that you create.
演奏を始めたのが70年代の初め頃なんですけど、
he first started performing early in the 1970s. Before that, he'd been involved in sort of, I suppose, what he calls self-study events, where he just listened to nature. And one of the sort of, results of all of that listening was he became very interested in echoes. So the instrument he was playing today is called an alapos, which is an echo instrument which he designed. And when he designed that, he then began to perform it himself. I mean, he'd never studied music formally, but he was very interested in the way that sound fitted into an overall environment. So he'd spend time listening to the wind, for example, or listening to the sound of little streams running through the landscape. And then he sort of began to see how sound worked in this whole environment. He'd begin to project his own voice into that environment, or try rubbing or knocking two stones together to create a sound in the environment as well.
So how did the first instrument that you made, what was the process when you actually started to build that?
およそ10年ぐらいエコー遊びをしてたわけね。日本は山がいっぱいあるんで。
One thing he'd been very interested in was echoes, and he says he'd been sort of playing around with echoes in nature, because Japan is a very mountainous country, so there are lots of places where we can get nice echoes in nature. So that was one thing he'd sort of been very interested in. But he was also sort of interested in all sorts of different art as well, and he had a studio, and he was painting, and he was making sculptures, and he had all sorts of bits and pieces lying around the studio. And then one day he saw that he had a couple of tin cans and a steel spring, and when he brought them together, it seemed to create an echo. That there was an echo there that seemed to be so similar to what you got in nature, and that was sort of the initial idea for that. So he sort of experimented then with different sizes of steel tube and different lengths of spring and so on.
The other side to the instruments is that seems inspired by nature, but the more ancient instruments is also a big part of your show today. How did that come about?
演奏活動の後にやってきた僕のやりたいことが。
It's a slightly complicated story in that at the end of the 80s there's a specific piece which he began to create, which is a piece called Space in the Sun. Which he didn't describe it, but it's actually two vertical walls of brick with a space in between, which he built in a very rural part of Japan. And the idea was that he would go there and he would sit between these two walls for 24 hours, and he would somehow cleanse his sense of hearing just by listening to the reflected sounds of the natural environment. And at the time he was still living in Tokyo, but he came to this place where he built these two walls. And he sort of became very interested in this place called Tango, which is quite an isolated and rural part of Japan. It's you have this image of Japan as being sort of very, very overpopulated and very dense and busy with a lot of people, but this is one place that was never urbanized, and it's still he says it's a place where the people who live there, they still fish, and they still seem to lead a kind of lifestyle that seems very not very closely linked to the modern. So while he was building this piece there, he decided, well, I'd like to live somewhere like this. And he eventually moved there, and when he was moving there, he found that there had been people living in that part of Japan for a very, very long time. And these kind of little clay and stone flutes were things that were often dug up in excavation sites around the area. So he became very interested in actually trying to learn something from the past, trying to learn something from how people experience the world and how people experience sound hundreds of years ago, or in this case even thousands of years ago, and that's really where that interest came from, the area itself and the kind of objects that were being dug up there when he started living there.
単語というランドスケープが何かさせてくれるわけです。そこで耳を澄ますと
no, he was just saying that there's something about that particular landscape in Tango. When he moved there, and he said, somehow it seems to cleanse his sense of hearing or purify his sense of hearing. You can be sitting in the landscape and you can hear frogs, for example, and there's something about the sound that they produce in that landscape that there isn't anything false about it. It just is what it is, and it exists naturally without any sort of preconceptions or anything like that. So he sort of listened to these things, and then he says he wants to become himself part of that particular landscape. So the way that he plays that flute are ways which are designed to somehow blend himself, become part of that landscape. He says it's almost like he wants to become a plant, so just growing there in that ground, in that part of the country.